When my parents disowned me at 10, my wealthy uncle took me in. 18 years later, my mother arrived at his will reading expecting millions until I shut her up. The lawyer arrived in horror. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Imani. I am 28 years old, and I am the founder of a highly successful private equity firm specializing in debt acquisition. I sit here today completely ready to execute a long-awaited plan. Get out of here right now, Imani. This is a private reading for the real family. You have absolutely no right to sit at this table. My mother Yvonne spat the cruel words at me across the massive mahogany conference table in the heart of downtown Atlanta. Her voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls of Attorney Sterling's law office. She adjusted her designer silk scarf and glared at me with the same intense disdain she had perfected over the past 2 decades. I sat perfectly still in my tailored black suit. I did not blink. I did not flinch at all. I remained entirely, completely focused. Beside my mother sat my older sister, Dominique. She was 30 years old and the undeniable golden child of our family. Dominique practically radiated a toxic entitlement as she dramatically adjusted her posture to make sure everyone in the room caught the bright glare of her gold Spelman College alumni ring. She leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the polished wood. "You really have some nerve showing your face here today, Imani." Dominique sneered, her lips curling into a nasty smile. "We all know Uncle Desmond only took you in because you were a pathetic charity case. You were an embarrassment to the family name back then, and you are an absolute embarrassment now. Do you remember when you humiliated us at the country club when you were 10? Mom and Dad had to cut you off just to save our pristine reputation in Atlanta high society. You never fit in with our elite world." I looked past my hateful sister to the man sitting next to her. Brad was Dominique's husband. He was a white man in his early 30s who made his money in cryptocurrency. He constantly projected an aura of arrogant superiority, especially when dealing with me. He loved to play the role of the wealthy white savior who had graced a prominent black family with his magnificent presence. Brad let out a loud laugh that filled the tense room. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out his designer wallet, and extracted a crisp $100 bill. He casually flicked his wrist, tossing the bill across the table. It fluttered in the air before landing right in front of my folded hands. "Do us all a massive favor, Imani," Brad said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "Take this $100 and catch an Uber back to whatever ghetto apartment you crawled out of. We are about to be very busy dividing up millions of dollars, and we do not need you begging for scraps when the numbers get too big for your little brain to understand. Run along now, little sister." I stared at the crisp bill resting quietly on the table. 18 years ago, a gesture like this would have crushed my spirit entirely. When I was 10 years old, my parents literally packed my bags and dropped me at Uncle Desmond's doorstep because I refused to conform to their superficial pageant girl standards. They cared far more about their social standing among the Atlanta black elite than their own youngest daughter. Uncle Desmond was my mother's older brother. He was a logistics billionaire who saw my immense potential when my parents only saw a massive liability. He raised me as his own. He taught me everything about private equity business acquisitions and ruthless corporate strategy. I spent the last decade secretly building my own empire while my family spent their time maintaining an illusion of extreme wealth through heavy debt. They had absolutely no idea who I really was or what I had built. The heavy wooden doors of the conference room swung open. Attorney Sterling stepped inside. He was a distinguished older man who had managed Uncle Desmond's complex legal affairs for 30 years. Today he looked distressed. He was sweating profusely, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a thick leather binder. He walked to the head of the table, but before he even opened the binder, he turned directly to me. He bowed his head respectfully. "Miss Imani," he said, his voice completely deferential. "As the designated executor and the majority shareholder, would you like me to begin the reading now?" My mother gasped. Her hand flew to her pearl necklace in shock. Executor! She shrieked, her voice pitching upward in disbelief. What on earth are you talking about, Sterling? Desmond would never put this worthless outcast in charge of our money. Start reading the actual will immediately. I gave Attorney Sterling a slight authoritative nod, giving him permission to proceed. He wiped his brow with a cotton handkerchief and opened the heavy binder. According to the final testament of Desmond Hayes, Attorney Sterling read, his voice shaking slightly under the intense, aggressive stares of my family. To my niece Dominique, I leave the physical structure of the Buckhead Mansion located at 12 Oakwood Drive. My mother and Dominique immediately erupted into loud cheers. Dominique clapped her hands together, squealing with absolute delight, while Brad pumped his fist in the air. That house is worth at least $12 million, Brad boasted, looking at me with pure triumph. We are going to throw the biggest parties Atlanta has ever seen. Attorney Sterling cleared his throat loudly. Please allow me to finish, he requested nervously. And to my niece Imani, I leave all outstanding debt obligations, various holding accounts, and the entirety of my struggling shell companies. The room went dead silent for exactly 1 second before Brad burst into hysterical laughter. My mother and sister quickly joined him, pointing at me across the table, as if I were the punchline to a brilliant joke. Oh my God. Dominique gasped, wiping a tear of laughter from her eye. He left you his garbage. You are literally the CEO of garbage. Brad slammed his hand on the table, highly amused by his own cruelty. Congratulations on inheriting a massive pile of debt, Imani. If you need a job to pay off those worthless companies, my crypto firm is always looking for a new janitor. I will even let you keep the $100 for your uniform expenses. I just sat there watching them celebrate my supposed downfall. They were so blinded by their own greed and arrogance that they failed to realize they had just stepped directly into the greatest financial trap my uncle and I had ever built. I ignored their laughter. I did not raise my voice or show the anger that had fueled me for 18 years. Instead, I calmly reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a gold fountain pen Uncle Desmond gave me when I closed my first major acquisition. I leaned forward and smoothly signed my name on the thick stack of legal documents, accepting full ownership of the so-called worthless shell companies. My mother Yvonne rolled her eyes at my calm demeanor, while Dominique practically danced in her seat with overwhelming joy. Brad signaled to an assistant waiting outside the room, and within seconds, a bottle of incredibly expensive champagne was brought in. They popped the cork right there in the solemn law office, celebrating their $12 million inheritance, while acting as if I did not even exist in the same room. You can leave now, Imani, my mother said, taking a long sip from her crystal flute. You got your little debt collection. Now let the adults discuss how to renovate Dominique's new mansion. We need to hire a luxury interior designer immediately to get rid of whatever tacky, outdated furniture Desmond left behind. I placed my pen back into my pocket and picked up a slim manila folder I had brought with me. I slowly slid a single crisp document across the polished mahogany table directly toward Dominique. She paused, her champagne glass halfway to her lips, and stared at the paper in total confusion. What is this? She asked, her tone dripping with absolute annoyance. Is this your resume? I told you we do not need a janitor for our new estate. It is a property deed, I said, my voice perfectly even and calm, masking the storm of satisfaction brewing inside me. I suggest you read it very carefully before you start picking out new designer curtains for your mansion. Brad snatched the document from the table and began to read it, his eyes quickly scanning the dense legal jargon. His smug, self-satisfied smile began to falter ever so slightly. What is this garbage, Sterling? Brad demanded, tossing the paper back onto the table with a loud smack. It says something about exclusive land rights and structural separation. Attorney Sterling looked terrified as he adjusted his glasses on his nose. He swallowed hard before looking directly at my father Marcus, who had been quietly calculating their new net worth in his head. That document is absolutely correct. Attorney Sterling explained, his voice trembling under the intense scrutiny. The late Mr. Desmond Hayes bequeathed the physical structure of the Buckhead Mansion to Dominique. However, The physical structure is legally separated from the land it sits upon. The entire 50-acre estate, including the manicured grounds, the long driveway, and the only private access road connecting the property to the main highway, belongs to a holding entity known as Apex Holdings. My father slammed his hands flat on the table, causing the champagne flutes to rattle dangerously. And who exactly owns Apex Holdings? He demanded, his voice booming with sudden, uncontrollable aggression. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my arms comfortably. I do, I said quietly, letting the truth settle over them. Apex Holdings is one of those worthless shell companies you were all just laughing about a few minutes ago. You see, Uncle Desmond was a brilliant man. He knew exactly how greedy and superficial this family was, so he set up a very specific legal structure years ago. Dominique owns the bricks and the drywall of that $12 million house. But she cannot legally walk out the front door, park a luxury car in the driveway, or connect a simple water pipe without my explicit written permission. I own the ground beneath your feet. The silence in the room was absolute. The celebratory atmosphere vanished instantly, replaced by a suffocating tension that made the air feel incredibly heavy. My mother stared at me, her mouth slightly open, as the reality of my words began to sink in. Dominique dropped her champagne glass completely. It shattered against the hardwood floor, spilling expensive alcohol over the fine Persian rugs, but nobody moved to clean it up. "You have to be kidding me!" Dominique shrieked, her voice reaching a high, hysterical pitch. "Dad, tell them they cannot do this. This is my house. It was left to me. It is a typo." My father, Marcus, lunged forward, pointing an aggressive finger directly at Attorney Sterling. "Fix this immediately, Sterling. You incompetent fool. Desmond would never divide an estate like this. You will amend this document right now, or I will sue this entire firm into the ground." Attorney Sterling shrank back in his leather chair but held his ground firmly. "I cannot do that, Marcus. The deeds are ironclad and were recorded with the city of Atlanta 3 years ago. Miss Imani has absolute legal authority over the land. Any attempt to use the property without her consent constitutes criminal trespassing." I picked up the $100 bill Brad had thrown at me earlier and slowly slid it back across the table toward him. "I believe you might need this to help with your new living expenses," I said, maintaining direct eye contact with him. "Because effective immediately, the rent for the land your mansion sits on is $500,000 a month, payable directly to my private equity firm. If the rent is not paid in full by the 1st of every month, I will legally sever your access to the main road and cut off all utilities to the house." My mother gasped, clutching her chest as if she could not breathe. $500,000 a month, she cried out, her voice breaking. "That is pure extortion. You cannot do this to your own family, Imani. We are your blood." I looked at her with zero sympathy in my heart. "You stopped being my family the day you dumped me on Uncle Desmond's porch because I embarrassed you at an elite country club," I replied, my voice cold as ice. "You abandoned a 10-year-old child without a single second thought. Do not try to play the family card now just because I hold the keys to your precious status symbol." Dominique burst into loud, sobbing tears, burying her face in her hands. Brad, however, stood up abruptly. He buttoned his suit jacket and ran a hand through his hair, trying desperately to regain his arrogant composure. He looked at me and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You really think you have won, do not you?" Brad sneered, stepping closer to the edge of the table. "You think playing real estate games with a piece of dirt makes you powerful? You are playing entirely out of your league, little girl. I run a highly successful crypto fund. I deal with tens of millions of dollars before breakfast. You want 500 grand a month? Fine. I will write you a check right now. In fact, I will just buy the stupid land from your little shell company. I will bury you in so much money you will forget you even tried this pathetic stunt." I looked up at Brad, noting the slight bead of sweat forming on his forehead, despite his exceptionally confident words. He was trying to assert his dominance, trying to prove that his wealth was superior to my strategic planning. He thought he could simply buy his way out of the massive trap I had set. He had absolutely no idea that his precious crypto fund was already bleeding out, and that the very money he was bragging about was heavily leveraged against dangerous debts he could not possibly repay. I smiled at him, a slow, predatory smile that made him pause in his tracks. "Please do, Brad," I said softly. "I eagerly look forward to seeing your bank statements." They left the law office that day laughing. My mother practically dragged Dominique and Brad out the door, assuring them that my threats were nothing more than the desperate cries of a jealous little girl. In their minds, I was still just the outcast trying to play pretend in a world of giants. They completely ignored the certified letters my firm sent the following week. They threw the payment demands directly into the trash. Instead of paying the $500,000 they owed for the land rent, they doubled down on their extravagant lifestyle. Dominique hosted lavish dinners and attended high-profile charity galas, making sure local society photographers captured her dripping in designer jewelry. They paraded around Atlanta, acting as though they were completely untouchable. They spent their days bad-mouthing me to anyone who would listen, painting me as the bitter, estranged relative trying to steal their rightful inheritance. Their delusion reached its absolute peak 2 weeks later at the Piedmont Driving Club. It was a beautiful Tuesday afternoon, and my mother was hosting a prestigious luncheon on the outdoor terrace. The guest list included the most elite and influential Black women in Atlanta society. Women who sat on museum boards and controlled massive philanthropic funds. I knew exactly where my family would be because I had been tracking their every move. Through the tall glass doors of the clubhouse, my security team and I watched as my mother held court at the center table. She was sipping a mimosa and waving her hands dramatically as she regaled her wealthy friends with a twisted version of our family history. I do not know why Imani insists on being so difficult. My mother sighed loudly, ensuring the women at the surrounding tables could hear her tragic tale. I gave that girl every opportunity to succeed. I bought her the best dresses. I hired top-tier coaches for the Miss Georgia Peach pageant when she was a little girl, but she just refused to cooperate. She wanted to read boring books and wear ugly sweatpants. She purposely humiliated us at the spring gala when she was 10. She threw a tantrum and refused to wear the matching pastel gowns I bought for the family photos. A mother can only do so much to fix a defective child. I had no choice but to send her to live with Desmond. She simply did not fit our family brand. The women at the table nodded in sympathetic agreement, completely validating my mother's awful narrative. Dominique chimed in right on cue, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. She has always been incredibly ungrateful. Brad and I even offered her a job at his financial firm out of pure pity, but she chose to cause a scene instead. We are just trying to move on and enjoy our new home, but she keeps sending us fake legal notices. It was the perfect moment to strike. I gave a sharp nod to the two men standing beside me. They were not just security guards. They were high-level process servers dressed in immaculate dark suits. They walked out onto the sunlit terrace, moving with absolute purpose. The lively chatter on the terrace died down immediately as the two imposing men approached my mother's table. Everyone stared. In this elite circle, uninvited guests were a massive scandal. Dominique Hayes and Brad Hayes. The lead process server announced, his deep voice carrying clearly across the silent patio. Dominique froze her mimosa halfway to her mouth. Brad stood up, his face flushing red with sudden anger. "Who are you and how did you get in here?" Brad demanded, puffing out his chest. "This is a private club." The server did not blink. He simply pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his leather briefcase and dropped them directly onto the center of the table, right on top of my mother's expensive large floral centerpiece. "You have been officially served," the server stated loudly. "This is a formal 14-day notice of eviction regarding the property located at 12 Oakwood Drive. As you are currently in default of your land lease agreement, totaling $500,000, you must vacate the premises immediately or face forced removal by county sheriffs." A collective gasp rippled across the terrace. The wealthy women sitting with my mother stared in absolute shock. Whispers broke out immediately. "Did he say eviction? Are they losing the Buckhead mansion? I thought they were rich." My mother turned pale white. Her hands trembled so violently she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. Dominique let out a high-pitched shriek, grabbing the documents and staring at the bright red eviction stamp on the front page. Brad snatched the papers out of his wife's hands. He looked around at the judging faces of Atlanta high society, and his pride took over. He ripped the eviction notice in half and threw the pieces onto the patio floor. "This is a joke," Brad shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the servers. "Tell your little boss Imani that she is messing with the wrong guy. My hedge fund manages hundreds of millions. I will bury her in litigation for the next 30 years. She will be bankrupt before she ever steps foot on my property again." He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his hands shaking with adrenaline and rage. He dialed a private number and pressed the phone hard against his ear, pacing back and forth frantically in front of the stunned country club guests. The veins in his neck bulged. "Listen to me very carefully," Brad barked into the phone, ignoring the horrified stares of the women around him. "I need you to activate that $8 million line of credit we discussed yesterday. Yes, I mean right now. I do not care about the interest rate. Just push the funding through the system immediately. I have a massive pest problem to exterminate right now." While Brad screamed into his phone on the sunlit terrace of the Piedmont Driving Club, my view was entirely different. I sat in my corner office on the 40th floor of a sleek glass skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. My private equity firm, Vanguard Acquisitions, occupied the entire top floor. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the city I practically owned. Massive digital dashboards wrapped around the room, tracking global market fluctuations and private debt portfolios in real time. I was not the struggling outcast my family wanted me to be. I was a ruthless corporate acquisition specialist who bought dying companies, stripped them to their bones, and rebuilt them for massive profit. My lead financial analyst, David, stepped into my office holding an encrypted tablet. He placed it directly on my desk. "He just submitted the application, Miss Hayes," David said, his voice perfectly professional. "Bradley Hayes requested an $8 million emergency line of credit from First Atlanta Bank. He requested expedited processing." I picked up the tablet and scanned the digital application. Brad was desperate. He was attempting to leverage the physical structure of the Buckhead mansion as primary collateral for the massive loan. He assumed his connections and his arrogant charm would push the paperwork through without any genuine scrutiny. He was an absolute fool. "Flag the asset," I instructed David without looking up from the screen. "Execute the primary block. The physical structure of that $12 million mansion holds absolutely zero market value without the land it sits upon. Send a certified legal notice to First Atlanta Bank and every other major lending institution in the state of Georgia. Inform their risk assessment departments that Apex Holdings owns the ground beneath the collateral. Any bank that issues a loan against that property will instantly inherit a deeply contested and legally toxic asset." David smiled a sharp, knowing smile. "I will send the notices immediately. They will not touch him with a 10-foot pole." Within 48 hours, my blockade worked flawlessly. I sat at my desk and watched the digital dominoes fall exactly as I had planned. First Atlanta Bank denied Brad the $8 million. He panicked and applied at a secondary lending institution. They denied him within 2 hours. He tried a private wealth management firm. They flagged his profile as a critical risk and froze his existing accounts pending a standard review. Because my shell company controlled the foundational assets of his entire lifestyle, every single financial institution in the city treated him like radioactive waste. He was completely trapped with absolutely no way to access liquid capital. Despite the invisible financial noose tightening rapidly around her husband's neck, Dominique remained entirely oblivious. My sister lived exclusively for the approval of other people. She needed constant validation from the Atlanta Black elite to feel relevant. Instead of recognizing the severe danger they were in, she decided to double down on the illusion of extreme wealth. She wanted to prove to everyone who had witnessed my eviction notice at the country club that our family was utterly untouchable. My surveillance team monitored their public movements carefully. Dominique booked a massive lavish housewarming party at the Buckhead mansion. She spared absolutely no expense blowing through what little liquid cash they had left on credit cards that were terrifyingly close to their limits. She hired the most exclusive catering company in the city. She ordered custom ice sculptures, imported beluga caviar, and hundreds of bottles of vintage champagne. She demanded massive floral installations featuring rare white orchids to decorate the sweeping grand staircase. The total budget for this ridiculous display of false prosperity exceeded $200,000. She called our mother Yvonne daily to brag about the guest list. Our mother happily fed into the delusion. They invited local politicians, prominent real estate developers, and heavy-hitting investors who had previously done business with Brad. They wanted to create a spectacle so grand that it would completely erase the memory of my threats. Dominique wanted to stand in the center of that mansion wearing a designer gown and completely invalidate my existence. She wanted to look down her nose at the world and prove that she was the absolute pinnacle of success. She completely ignored all the obvious warning signs. She ignored the fact that Brad was sweating profusely during dinner. She ignored the way he constantly checked his phone with shaking hands. She ignored the final notices arriving in the mail, which he frantically shredded before she could read them. She cared only about the aesthetic. The superficial appearance of absolute power was the only thing that mattered to her. I sat in my pristine, quiet office as the sun set over the Atlanta skyline. A soft chime echoed from my private computer terminal. I clicked the mouse and opened the notification. It was a digital invitation forwarded by one of my corporate insiders who had made Dominique's exclusive guest list. The elegant gold lettering on the screen cordially invited the recipient to the premier housewarming event of the season at the Buckhead estate. The party was scheduled for this upcoming Saturday evening at exactly 8 o'clock. I leaned back in my leather chair and allowed a genuine smile to cross my face. They wanted a grand spectacle. I was more than happy to provide one. I pressed the intercom button on my desk, connecting directly to my head of private security and my lead operations manager. "Marcus, get all the teams ready immediately." I commanded, my voice echoing with icy anticipation. "I need the heavy utility contractors fully briefed and on standby. Tell the private security detail to gear up for a highly coordinated operation. We are making an uninvited appearance at the Buckhead mansion this Saturday night. Make absolutely sure the heavy construction barricades are loaded onto the flatbed trucks. We are going to plunge their perfect little party into the dark ages." The warm Atlanta night air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and imported white orchids. Dominique's $200,000 housewarming party was in full swing, and the Buckhead mansion looked like a scene pulled directly from a luxury lifestyle magazine. Valets in crisp white jackets jogged down the sweeping driveway, carefully parking a continuous stream of Bentleys, Ferraris, and Aston Martins. Inside the massive double doors, a live string quartet played classical renditions of modern pop songs, while waitstaff in black ties circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. My mother Yvonne stood at the center of the grand foyer, practically glowing under the massive crystal chandelier. She was holding court surrounded by the city's most influential socialites and politicians. She took a delicate sip from her crystal flute and gestured dramatically toward Dominique, who was holding onto Brad's arm across the room. "Look at them!" My mother boasted, her voice carrying over the elegant music. "They truly are the future of Atlanta. Brad is expanding his financial empire globally, and my Dominique has transformed this estate into a true masterpiece. It takes a certain pedigree to maintain this level of excellence. Of course, good breeding always shows itself eventually." She laughed, a high, brittle sound, completely ignoring the fact that their entire lavish display was funded by credit cards that were currently screaming toward their limits. Outside, the steady flow of arriving luxury vehicles suddenly came to a halt. A custom matte black Maybach glided silently up the private access road, bypassing the valet line entirely and parking directly in front of the grand entrance. The heavy tinted doors swung open, and I stepped out onto the pristine cobblestone driveway. I wore a tailored crimson evening gown that radiated power and a diamond necklace that cost more than my mother's entire carefully curated wardrobe. Whispers immediately rippled through the crowd gathered on the front terrace. Heads turned, and the polite chatter began to die down as I walked up the marble steps. Brad spotted me from the foyer, his face instantly drained of color before flushing with a violent, aggressive red. He dropped his champagne glass onto a side table and marched aggressively toward the entrance, signaling for his hired private security team to follow him. He intercepted me just as I crossed the threshold, flanked by two massive men in dark suits. "What the hell do you think you are doing here, Imani?" Brad hissed, keeping his voice low but dripping with absolute venom. "I did not invite you. You need to turn around and get back in your little rental car before I have you physically thrown out." I stood my ground, completely ignoring his aggressive posture. I looked past him at the wealthy white investors he'd been desperately trying to impress all night. They were watching the exchange with keen interest. Brad noticed them watching and immediately puffed out his chest, playing directly to his audience. He raised his voice, adopting a patronizing tone filled with racially coded microaggressions. "Look, I know you are probably angry and confused, little sister," Brad announced loudly, ensuring his investor friends could hear every word. "But this is an exclusive private event. We do not need your aggressive energy ruining the atmosphere for civilized people. This is not some loud downtown club where you can just force your way through the door. Security, please escort this hostile woman off my property before she gets violent." The two large security guards stepped forward, reaching out to grab my arms. I did not flinch. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. My own security detail, who had quietly followed me from the Maybach, instantly stepped between me and Brad's men. The sheer size and professional tactical gear of my team made Brad's rented guards back away immediately. The music from the string quartet screeched to a halt. The entire foyer fell completely silent. Everyone was staring at us. Dominique pushed her way through the crowd, rushing to Brad's side with my mother trailing frantically behind her. "Imani, get out!" Dominique screamed, her pristine hostess facade completely shattering. "You are ruining my night. You are trespassing." I reached into my crimson clutch and pulled out a thick legal document bound with a bright red county seal. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a sharp, clear authority that commanded the entire room. "Actually, Dominique, I am the only person here who is not trespassing." I held the court injunction up for the crowd to see. I turned my attention away from my furious family and addressed the hundreds of elite guests directly. "Good evening, everyone. I apologize for the interruption, but there is a slight legal technicality you should all be aware of. The land you are currently standing on is owned by Apex Holdings. The residents of this physical structure are currently in severe default of their $500,000 monthly land lease. Furthermore, their financial accounts have been flagged for extreme risk, and all lines of credit have been completely frozen." Gasps echoed through the grand foyer. My mother let out a strangled cry, clutching her pearls. The wealthy investors Brad had been courting immediately began whispering furiously to one another, pulling out their phones to check their financial alerts. Brad lunged forward, his face contorted in pure rage. "She is lying!" He screamed at the top of his lungs, spit flying from his lips. "She is a bitter, jealous liar. I own this estate. I control everything. Do not listen to a single word this crazy woman says." I looked at him with absolute pity. I did not argue. I simply lowered my hand and looked down at the face of my platinum watch. The second hand ticked precisely toward the top of the hour. 3. I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive hall. 2. Brad scrambled forward, screaming for security to arrest me. 1. My mother buried her face in her hands. 0. Exactly on my final word, a loud, heavy mechanical clunk echoed from the depths of the property. The massive crystal chandelier above us instantly went black. The landscape lighting outside died. The music, the ambient glow, the absolute luxury, it all vanished in a fraction of a second. The entire $12 million mansion plunged into pitch darkness. The immediate silence was deafening. The elegant string quartet stopped playing with a harsh screech of a violin bow against strings. For a split second, the only sound was the collective intake of breath from hundreds of Atlanta's most elite socialites. Then pure, absolute panic erupted. Women screamed in the pitch-black foyer. The backup generators which Brad had bragged about installing did not kick in. They could not kick in because my utility contractors had legally and completely severed the main power lines at the exact boundary where my land met their foundation. Simultaneously, the massive ornate water fountains decorating the front lawns sputtered and died. The caterers in the kitchen began shouting that the water pressure had vanished entirely. I had shut off the main water valve located perfectly on my side of the property line. A loud mechanical grinding noise echoed up the long winding driveway. It was the unmistakable sound of heavy construction equipment. My contractors were dropping massive concrete barricades directly across the entrance of the private road. I was legally sealing off my land. The guests did not wait for an explanation. The wealthy investors, politicians, and real estate moguls completely abandoned their polite society manners. They shoved each other in the dark, desperate to escape the massive embarrassment unfolding around them. Cell phone flashlights snapped on, casting wild swinging beams of harsh white light across the terrified crowd. The mass exodus was an absolute disaster. Elite socialites stumbled blindly toward the grand double doors. I watched a prominent museum board member snap the heel off her custom Christian Louboutin shoe as she tripped over the marble threshold. Another wealthy heiress caught her expensive silk gown on a decorative iron planter, ripping the fabric completely as she sprinted blindly toward the valet station. Outside, the chaos multiplied. The valets could not retrieve the luxury vehicles because the concrete barricades were causing a massive bottleneck at the bottom of the estate. Furious guests were forced to abandon their cars and walk in the dark, ruining their expensive shoes in the muddy landscaping. Dominique's meticulously planned $200,000 housewarming party had transformed into a humiliating, panicked stampede. I watched her entire social reign over Atlanta, high society, collapse into a dirty, miserable joke right in front of her eyes. "Imani, you absolute monster!" My father Marcus shoved his way through the fleeing crowd. He marched directly up to me, his face contorted with a terrifying rage. The harsh glare from his cell phone flashlight illuminated the deep, furious lines around his mouth. My mother Yvonne was right behind him, gripping his arm tightly. "You are destroying this family!" Marcus bellowed, his deep voice vibrating with fury over the screams of the departing guests. "You are destroying decades of generational wealth out of pure, petty jealousy. You have always been jealous of Dominique. You have always resented her because she is beautiful and successful and beloved by this city. You orchestrated this entire sick stunt just to ruin her perfect night." My mother stepped forward, tears of absolute humiliation streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Her carefully crafted social image was dead, and she knew it. "You are a vile, ungrateful child, Imani," Yvonne screamed, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "Your Uncle Desmond took you in and gave you a life, and you use his resources to terrorize your own blood. We are your parents. Dominique is your sister. How can you be so vicious? How can you be so cold?" I stood my ground. My security team shifted closer, but I held up a hand signaling them to wait. I looked at my parents, bathed in the harsh artificial light of their phones. "Generational wealth." I repeated the words slowly, letting a cold laugh escape my lips. "You do not have generational wealth, Marcus. You have generational debt. You have spent your entire lives pretending to be royalty while drowning in loans you can never repay. Dominique is not successful. She is married to a fraud who just had his entire credit portfolio frozen by every major bank in Georgia. I am not doing this out of jealousy. I am doing this because I am a debt collector and your account is severely past due. You had 14 days to pay the rent for the land beneath your feet. You chose to throw a $200,000 party instead. Actions have very real consequences." Brad stumbled into the foyer looking completely unhinged. His expensive suit jacket was torn and he was sweating profusely. He was still screaming into his phone, but the line was dead. The banks had officially cut him off. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, but he did not dare step closer. My security team was a silent, impenetrable wall around me. "I suggest you start packing your bags," I told my father, keeping my voice completely calm and devoid of any emotion. You have exactly 12 hours to vacate the physical structure before the county sheriff arrives to forcefully remove you for trespassing on my land. I will be waiting at the front gate. I turned my back on them, fully prepared to walk out the front door and leave them standing in the dark ruins of their fake empire. I had executed my plan flawlessly. I had humiliated them in front of the entire city. I had severed their utilities and isolated their house. They had absolutely no money and nowhere to run. Then a sharp, unnatural sound cut through the darkness. It was a laugh, a high-pitched, manic laugh that sent a sudden, unexpected chill down my spine. I stopped walking and slowly turned around. My mother, Yvonne, was no longer crying. The tears had stopped completely. She stood in the center of the dark foyer, laughing hysterically as the last of her wealthy friends fled out the door. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out something that made the air in the room suddenly feel very thin. It was a pristine, heavy parchment envelope. Even in the dim light of the cell phone beams, I could clearly see the thick red wax seal stamped on the back. It bore Uncle Desmond's personal crest. "You really think you are the smartest person in the room, Imani?" Yvonne sneered, her voice dripping with a toxic, triumphant venom. "You think Desmond trusted you completely. He knew exactly what you were. He always knew you were a vicious, ungrateful snake just waiting to strike. He raised you, but he never truly loved you." She waved the sealed envelope in the air, laughing loudly as Brad and Dominique stared at her in shock. "Desmond knew you would try to destroy us the moment he died." Yvonne gloated, her eyes wide and manic. "So he left me a failsafe. He left his real family an insurance policy that completely overrides every single pathetic corporate trick you just pulled. You did not inherit the real power, Imani. I did." Yvonne's manic laughter bounced off the high ceiling of the dark foyer. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she snapped the heavy red wax seal. The sharp crack echoed loudly in the tense silence. She slid a thick stack of legal parchment from the envelope. The paper was crisp and pristine. She thrust it into the harsh beam of my father's cell phone flashlight. I recognized the official letterhead immediately. It was from one of the most exclusive and secretive wealth management firms in Zurich. "Read it and weep," Yvonne sneered, shoving the document toward my face. "Desmond was not the fool you thought he was. He established an offshore Swiss trust completely separate from the domestic estate. It holds $20 million in untraceable liquid capital. He legally designated me as the sole beneficiary in the event of a critical family emergency. An emergency exactly like this one." I stared at the paperwork. The authorization clause was perfectly clear. It granted Yvonne immediate and absolute access to the offshore funds if the primary estate was ever placed in financial jeopardy. The signature at the bottom was undeniably Uncle Desmond's. Yvonne stepped closer. The harsh light casting deep shadows across her face made her look almost demonic. "You always thought you were his favorite," she whispered, her voice dripping with pure toxic malice. "You thought because he taught you how to read a balance sheet that he actually respected you. You were nothing but a project to him, Imani, a pathetic little charity case he took in because he felt sorry for you." She jabbed a manicured finger at my chest. "He told me the truth before he died. He said you were too cold and too ruthless. He called you a mistake. He knew you lacked the loyalty of true blood family, so he made absolutely sure the real money stayed completely out of your hands. He left this trust to me to protect us from you." The silence that followed her cruel revelation was absolute. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I absorbed the venom of her words and analyzed the situation with cold, calculated precision. Brad let out a sudden, explosive breath of relief. The sheer terror that had gripped him only moments ago vanished instantly. His posture shifted from a defeated slump to rigid, arrogant defiance. He stepped forward and wrapped a heavy, possessive arm around Dominique's waist, pulling her tight against his side. The smug, entitled smirk returned to his sweating face. $20 million. Brad said the words rolling off his tongue like a prayer. He ran a hand through his damp hair and laughed, a loud booming sound that carried over the distant shouts of the fleeing guests outside. "Did you hear that, Imani? 20 million in offshore liquid cash. He stepped out from behind my mother, pointing a finger directly at my face. By 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will personally call Zurich. I will wire those funds directly into my primary accounts. I will pay off your pathetic little land lease before lunch. And then, little sister, I am coming after you with everything I have. Brad was practically vibrating with renewed aggressive energy. With that kind of capital, I will buy out Apex Holdings. I will purchase the debt of every shell company you use to hide your assets. I will pave over every single inch of land you think you control. And when I am done dismantling your entire life, I will personally call the county sheriff and have you thrown in a federal cell for corporate extortion and trespassing. You played your hand too early, Imani. Now you are finished. Dominique leaned her head against Brad's shoulder. Her tears of humiliation magically dried up. She looked at me with absolute disgust. You are a joke, Imani. You will always be a joke. Get out of my dark house. I looked at the four of them standing together in the gloom. They were so desperate for a victory, they were clinging to a piece of paper like a life raft. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me react to their insults. I simply memorized the date stamped next to Uncle Desmond's signature on that Swiss authorization form. Enjoy the dark, I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of all emotion. I turned my back on my family. My security detail instantly formed a tight wedge around me. We walked toward the grand entrance, our footsteps echoing loudly on the marble floor. I stepped out into the humid night air, leaving them standing in the pitch-black ruins of their fake empire. The scene outside was still pure chaos, but my tactical team easily cleared a path through the panicked crowd. My driver was waiting with the Maybach engine running silently. I slid into the spacious back seat and the heavy door slammed shut, blocking out the screams and the noise of the ruined party. Take us downtown, I instructed the driver. The privacy partition glided up seamlessly, isolating me in the back. I reached up and switched on the overhead reading light. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly bleed out of my system. I reached into my bag and pulled out my encrypted laptop. Yvonne thought her cruel words about Uncle Desmond would break me. She thought she could rewrite my history and make me feel like an unwanted outcast. But she severely underestimated my attention to detail. I opened the laptop and bypassed the biometric security protocols. I accessed my private servers, bypassing 3 separate firewalls until I reached the deepest layer of my personal archives. I clicked open the digital folder containing Uncle Desmond's comprehensive medical history. When Desmond got sick, I had hired the best private medical surveillance team in the world to monitor his condition. I had access to every chart, every vital sign, and every medication administered during the final 6 months of his life. I narrowed the search parameters, focusing exclusively on his final 30 days. I pulled up the exact date stamped on the Swiss authorization document Yvonne had just shoved in my face. The date he supposedly signed over $20 million to his sister. I cross-referenced the date with the primary medical log from his intensive care unit. I stared at the glowing screen as the undeniable truth materialized in stark black and white data. On the exact date printed on that Swiss document, Uncle Desmond's oxygen levels had plummeted. His organs had begun to fail. The medical logs clearly stated that the attending physicians had placed him into a deep medically induced coma to stabilize his vitals. He remained completely unconscious and intubated for 4 straight days. He was physically incapacitated. He could not speak. He could not open his eyes. He certainly could not hold a pen and sign a highly complex offshore financial authorization. I closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click. A cold, predatory smile slowly spread across my face in the quiet darkness of the car. The document was an absolute forgery. My family had just handed me the very rope I would use to hang them. The interior of the Maybach was dead silent as the car glided smoothly through the dark Atlanta streets. I sat in the luxurious leather seat, processing the absolute magnitude of the lie Yvonne had just shoved in my face. I opened the encrypted laptop again to cross-reference the exact timestamp printed on the Swiss authorization document. The date stamped next to the forged signature was October the 12th. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the comprehensive medical logs from the final month of Uncle Desmond's life. On October the 10th, his respiratory system had suffered a catastrophic failure. The attending physicians at the intensive care unit had intubated him and placed him into a deep, medically induced palliative coma. He was immediately transferred to the private hospice suite I had built for him in the east wing of his estate. The medical charts from October the 12th were unequivocal and devastatingly clear. He was entirely unresponsive. His motor functions were completely non-existent. A man who cannot breathe without a ventilator cannot negotiate a highly complex offshore trust fund. The sheer audacity of their lie was almost impressive, but medical logs alone were just paper. In a court of law, Brad would hire expensive defense attorneys to argue that Desmond experienced a brief, miraculous moment of lucidity. I needed absolute, indisputable proof of their crime. I tapped a few keys and accessed the secure offshore servers of my private security firm. When Desmond was moved to the hospice suite, I did not trust my family to be alone with him. I knew their greed knew absolutely no bounds. I had my tactical team install covert high-definition surveillance cameras integrated directly into the smoke detectors and ventilation grates of his private room. It was originally intended to monitor his nursing staff to ensure he received the best possible care. Instead, it captured the ultimate betrayal. I filtered the massive cloud archive specifically for the evening of October the 12th. The server whirred quietly as it decrypted the video files. I synced the timestamp of the footage with the exact hour Brad claimed the document was authorized. A crisp infrared video filled my laptop screen. The hospital room was dark, illuminated only by the rhythmic flashing of Desmond's life support monitors. He lay perfectly still in the center of the large medical bed. He was a frail, silent shadow of the giant who had raised me. Then the heavy mahogany door slowly creaked open. My mother stepped into the room first. The infrared camera captured the frantic, nervous energy vibrating through her movements. She did not approach the bed to comfort her dying brother. She did not reach out to hold his hand or shed a single tear. She immediately turned her back to him and stood flush against the doorframe, gripping the brass handle tightly. She was standing watch. Her eyes darted back and forth, scanning the dark hallway outside. She was acting as the lookout for a desecration. A moment later, Brad slipped into the room holding a sleek leather portfolio under his arm. He did not possess the nervous, frantic energy of my mother. He moved with a cold, calculated, and deeply sinister purpose. He walked straight to the side of the medical bed and stared down at the man who had built the very financial empire he was currently trying to steal. Brad opened the portfolio and withdrew the heavy parchment document, the Swiss authorization form. He placed it perfectly flat on the rolling bedside table. I watched the screen in absolute disgusted silence as Brad reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small black ink pad. He leaned over the bed and grabbed Uncle Desmond's lifeless, limp hand. He aggressively pressed my dying uncle's thumb into the dark ink. Brad then forced the lifeless thumb down onto the bottom of the Swiss document, pressing hard to ensure a perfect, clear print. He then roughly wiped the ink from Desmond's skin with a sterile medical pad, casually tossing the evidence into the biohazard bin in the corner of the room. But a thumbprint was not enough for the notoriously strict Zurich bankers. They required a matching signature. Brad pulled a heavy silver fountain pen from his breast pocket. He leaned over the document directly under the unblinking lens of the hidden camera. For the next 10 minutes, I watched my brother-in-law meticulously trace and forge Uncle Desmond's signature, perfectly mimicking the sprawling loops and sharp, aggressive angles. When he finally finished, he held the paper up to the dim light of the medical monitors, admiring his own criminal handiwork. He nodded sharply to Yvonne, and the two of them slipped out of the room, leaving a dying man completely alone in the dark. The video ended and the screen went black. My pulse pounded in my ears, but my mind was incredibly clear. The level of pure depravity required to physically manipulate a comatose dying relative for financial gain was staggering. My family was not just greedy or desperate. They were criminally sociopathic. They had completely abandoned any shred of human decency. I picked up my phone and stared at the dark screen. I had the direct personal cell phone number of the Atlanta Chief of Police saved in my contacts. I could send this video file to him right now. Within 20 minutes, a swarm of police cruisers would descend on the dark Buckhead mansion. Brad and Yvonne would be dragged out of the estate in handcuffs. They would be publicly charged with state-level forgery, grand theft, and severe elder abuse. It would be an immediate and highly satisfying victory. But state-level charges were far too small for a betrayal of this magnitude. Brad had bragged that he would wire the funds from the Swiss Trust by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Moving $20 million across international borders using forged legal documents and stolen credentials was not a local crime. It was massive federal wire fraud. It was international money laundering. Executing that transfer triggered immediate global jurisdiction from the FBI, the Department of Justice, and Interpol. If I stopped them now, they might afford a legal team capable of plea bargaining their way into a light minimum security sentence. I slowly lowered my phone and placed it back in my bag. I was not going to stop them tonight. I was going to let them pull the trigger. I would let Brad initiate the international wire transfer and commit an irreversible federal felony. I was going to let them lock the doors of their own federal prison cell. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in catastrophic financial freefall. Without power or running water, the $12 million Buckhead mansion quickly transformed into an unbearable dark prison. My surveillance teams reported that Brad had managed to secure a massive industrial diesel generator, but the loud mechanical roaring and thick exhaust fumes completely ruined any remaining illusion of luxury. Dominique and Brad were drowning, and the water was rising fast. Creditors were calling their personal cell phones relentlessly. Debt collectors were leaving increasingly aggressive voicemails. The boutique leasing company that owned their fleet of luxury vehicles sent a flatbed truck to legally repossess Brad's Ferrari right out of the driveway. They were cornered, completely desperate and entirely out of options. That made them incredibly dangerous, but also entirely predictable. They needed that $20 million Swiss trust immediately. They could not afford to wait for international probate courts or standard legal verification. They needed liquid cash to save their crumbling social empire. Brad formulated a reckless plan fueled by pure arrogance. He convinced my father to liquidate the absolute last of his severely depleted retirement accounts. Marcus drained his 401k, taking a massive penalty, just to secure the liquid cash required to execute Brad's escape strategy. They used my father's final safety net to pay an exorbitant retainer fee to an elite private wealth representative based in downtown Atlanta who handled stateside transactions for the Zurich Bank. Brad also used the remaining cash to book a private Gulfstream jet. It sat waiting on the tarmac at DeKalb Peachtree Airport, ready to fly the four of them directly to Switzerland, the absolute second the offshore wire transfer cleared. They were packing their designer luggage, completely convinced they had beaten me. I sat in my glass corner office on the 40th floor watching their entire pathetic scheme unfold on my digital dashboards. I did not intervene. I simply prepared the net. I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed a direct line to a senior compliance director at the Zurich Financial Institution. We had crossed paths during several aggressive corporate acquisitions, and we understood each other perfectly. I did not explicitly claim the document was forged. If I cried fraud too early, the bank would simply reject the paperwork and freeze the account, protecting my family from federal prosecution. I wanted them prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of international law. Instead, I instructed the compliance director to place a silent, high-level FinCEN monitoring flag on Uncle Desmond's specific offshore account. I classified it under a highly confidential corporate merger protocol. I explicitly authorized the bank to let the incoming authorization process begin, but instructed them to lock the routing protocol the moment the biometric data was scanned. The trap was set flawlessly. The moment Brad submitted that forged document, he would not just be stealing. He would be triggering a silent alarm directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the international banking authorities. While Brad scrambled to finalize the fraudulent paperwork, Yvonne simply could not help herself. My mother possessed a pathological need for social validation that completely eclipsed her sense of self-preservation. Despite the fact that her daughter was living in a dark mansion powered by a noisy generator and her husband had just drained his life savings, she decided to celebrate. Yvonne booked a private dining room at the Piedmont Driving Club, paying the extravagant bill with a stack of crisp $100 bills from Marcus's liquidated retirement fund. She invited the few elite socialite friends who had not already blocked her number after the disastrous housewarming blackout. My private investigators sat discreetly at a corner table recording every single word of her arrogant display. Yvonne held court sipping premium champagne and laughing as if she had not a care in the world. She loudly boasted to her captive audience that she was about to become a liquid multimillionaire. She completely fabricated a beautiful tragic story claiming that Desmond had always known I was a terrible mistake. She told her friends that her brother had secretly come to her before he died, begging her to take his real fortune to protect the family from my vicious corporate greed. She gloated that I was about to be completely wiped out and humiliated. She was giving a masterclass in premeditated motive, completely unaware that her words were being recorded for a federal prosecutor. She was wrapping the noose tightly around her own neck and smiling while she did it. At exactly 2:00 that afternoon, Brad confidently walked into the soaring marble lobby of the International Banking Representative in downtown Atlanta. My surveillance team tracked him as he stepped into the private elevator. He was wearing a fresh bespoke suit and carrying the sleek leather portfolio containing the forged Swiss authorization. He was the absolute picture of arrogant entitlement. I sat perfectly still at my desk, my eyes locked on the specialized monitoring software displayed across my massive wall monitors. I watched the digital trace as Brad sat down across from the elite banking representative. He slid the pristine heavy parchment across the mahogany desk, demanding immediate processing for an expedited $20 million international wire transfer. The representative reviewed the document, noting Uncle Desmond's signature and the dark thumbprint at the bottom of the page. Following standard high-level security protocols, the representative placed the document onto a specialized biometric scanner to authenticate the ink thumbprint against the bank's encrypted digital records. Brad leaned back in his plush leather chair, crossing his legs and checking his gold watch, anticipating the sweet rush of absolute victory. The representative typed in the final authorization codes and hit enter. Brad waited for the screen to turn green. He waited for the confirmation of his $20 million salvation. Instead, the banking terminal instantly flashed a blinding warning red and the entire system completely locked down. The representative, a severely polished man named Sterling, recoiled from his desk as if the keyboard had suddenly caught fire. A sharp, piercing warning tone emitted from his computer tower, echoing loudly in the soundproof glass conference room. He frantically tapped a sequence of override keys, but the terminal was completely unresponsive. The glowing red warning banner reflected off his rimless glasses, painting his pale face in an eerie crimson light. Brad leaned forward and slapped his open palm against the rich mahogany desk. The sharp crack made Dominique jump. Brad demanded to know what the holdup was. He reminded Sterling of the exorbitant wire fee he had just paid in cash and insisted that a man of his standing did not have time for technical glitches. He commanded the banker to bypass the security screen and push the $20 million through immediately. Sterling slowly raised his head. His practiced customer service smile was completely gone, replaced by a look of sheer professional terror. He pushed his chair back, distancing himself from the document sitting on the scanner. He informed Brad that the transaction was permanently terminated. Sterling explained, his voice shaking slightly, that a Level 1 Financial Crimes Enforcement Network alert had just overridden the bank system. The account was not just frozen, it was actively red-flagged by Interpol and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for a fraudulent access attempt. Sterling stated that the system had automatically locked down the entire branch network and triggered an immediate reporting protocol to federal authorities. Brad stood up so fast his heavy leather chair crashed into the glass wall behind him. He screamed that there was a catastrophic system error. He pointed at the physical document on the desk, yelling that he had the legal authorization right there in black and white. He insisted the Swiss account belonged to his mother-in-law and that they were the victims of a banking error. Dominique shrank back into the corner of the room, clutching her designer purse like a shield, her eyes darting toward the locked door. Yvonne completely ignored the mention of federal authorities and began demanding to speak to the regional director. She shrieked that they were high-net-worth clients and would not be treated like common criminals by a mid-level desk clerk. She threatened to sue the bank for every asset they held for daring to delay her money. Marcus sat completely still at the far end of the table. His face was the color of wet ash. He looked at the red flashing monitor and finally realized the absolute magnitude of his mistake. The last fraction of his life savings had just evaporated to fund a federal crime. He was an accessory to international bank fraud. The heavy glass doors of the executive conference room glided open with a soft mechanical hiss cutting off Yvonne's tirade. I stepped over the threshold. I wore a tailored charcoal suit that cut a sharp, imposing silhouette against the bright bank lobby behind me. I was not alone. 3 members of my elite corporate legal team flanked me, moving with synchronized precision and carrying thick leather briefcases. I stopped at the head of the conference table and offered my family a calm, radiant smile. Brad froze. The aggressive posture instantly drained from his body, leaving him looking hollow and terrified. He looked from me to the flashing red monitor, and the terrible realization hit him. He knew exactly who had set the trap. Dominique let out a short, panicked gasp and pressed her hands over her mouth. Yvonne recovered her voice first. Her face twisted into a mask of pure feral hatred. She lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger with a sharp acrylic nail directly at my chest. She screamed that I had orchestrated this entire glitch. She yelled to the bank manager that I was a corporate hacker who had illegally infiltrated their secure banking network to steal her rightful inheritance. She demanded that Sterling call the police and have me arrested for cyber terrorism and corporate espionage. She ranted that I was a jealous, bitter outcast trying to ruin her family. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I did not offer a single word of defense against her absurd accusations. I simply unclasped my leather tote bag and pulled out a silver iPad. I placed the device squarely in the center of the polished mahogany table, ensuring the high-definition screen was perfectly angled toward the bank manager. I looked directly into Yvonne's panicked eyes, holding her gaze with absolute icy authority. I tapped the screen once. The hidden camera footage from Uncle Desmond's private hospice suite filled the display in crisp, flawless 4K resolution. The infrared video was hauntingly clear. It showed Yvonne standing watch at the door, her head darting back and forth into the hallway. It showed Brad marching to the side of the medical bed with ruthless intent. It showed him pulling out the ink pad and violently forcing a comatose dying man's thumb onto the very same Swiss authorization document that now sat on Sterling's desk. It captured every single meticulous stroke of Brad's silver fountain pen as he forged the signature under the flashing lights of the life support monitors. The silence in the conference room was absolute. The only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the sharp intake of breath from Sterling. He stared at the screen, his eyes wide with undeniable horror as he watched a federal crime unfold in unassailable high definition. He looked from the iPad playing the brutal violation of a dying man to the physical document sitting on his desk. He saw the exact matching thumbprint. He saw the exact forged signature. Sterling did not say a word. He did not attempt to argue or explain. He simply reached beneath the edge of his heavy mahogany desk and pressed the silent alarm for armed bank security. The heavy silence in the glass conference room was suddenly broken by the harsh electronic buzz of the outer security doors locking down. Brad spun around his tailored suit, suddenly looking like a cheap costume on a cornered rat. The aristocratic swagger he had weaponized against me for a decade vanished in a single panicked heartbeat. He lunged toward the glass wall, slamming his palms against the reinforced pane. He rattled the heavy handle of the conference room door, but the magnetic locks held firm. We were sealed inside. He whirled back to face the table, his chest heaving, his face a blotchy crimson. He did not look at me. He looked directly at my mother. "She made me do it," he screamed, his voice cracking with pure high-pitched hysteria. He pointed a trembling finger at Yvonne. "She is the one who planned the entire thing. She gave me the pen. She told me Desmond was basically dead anyway, and that we had to take the money before the estate went into probate." Yvonne gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. Her golden son-in-law, the man she had constantly compared me to, the man she claimed was the true standard of high-class wealth, was throwing her directly to the federal wolves to save his own skin. "How dare you?" She shrieked, her acrylic nails digging into the mahogany table. "It was your plan. You said you had the offshore connections to make the wire transfer look legitimate." The mask completely dissolved. Brad let out a vicious barking laugh that echoed sharply off the glass walls. "My connections." He sneered, his face twisting into a mask of absolute revulsion. "I am the only reason any of you had any actual credibility in this city. You think those elite country club boards let you in because of your pathetic little real estate flips, Marcus? You think the Piedmont Driving Club actually wanted you, Yvonne? They tolerated you people because of me. Because I gave your loud, greedy ghetto family a veneer of actual class." Marcus stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and incredibly old. He had just liquidated his entire life savings to fund the escape plan of a man who openly despised him. "You ungrateful bastard," Marcus choked out, stepping forward. Brad did not back down. He leaned over the table, showing his teeth. "I am not ungrateful, Marcus. I am just a much better capitalist than you will ever be. You handed over your retirement account because you were so desperate for my approval. You practically begged me to take your money because you thought my pedigree elevated your entire pathetic existence." I remained seated at the head of the table, watching the beautiful, chaotic implosion of the toxic hierarchy my parents had enforced for my entire life. They had worshipped his proximity to whiteness. They had equated Brad's pale skin and Ivy League degree with absolute superiority, treating him as the ultimate prize, while treating their own black daughter like an unwanted liability. The irony was deeply poetic and viciously satisfying. Dominique stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck. Her perfectly curated world, the designer clothes, the luxury cars, the illusion of absolute social superiority shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. "Brad," she whispered, her voice trembling with shock. "What are you saying? We are your family. We are your partners." "Family." Brad spat the word out like it was toxic venom. "You were a stepping stone, Dominique. A convenient stepping stone with a rich uncle. Do you honestly think I wanted to spend the rest of my life listening to your mother scheme and hustle like a common street grifter? You people are utterly pathetic. You are obsessed with flashing cash you do not even own. I only married you because Desmond had a 9-figure portfolio and I needed the capital to launch my own firm. You were an investment that just went entirely bankrupt." I watched my sister physically crumble. The absolute devastation on Dominique's face was complete. She had built her entire identity around being the chosen daughter, the one who secured the high-status white husband and elevated the family name. Now the man they had all worshipped was standing in a locked bank vault, calling them ghetto, and admitting he viewed them as nothing more than a profitable hustle. She reached out a shaking hand toward him, her designer bracelets clinking softly in the quiet room. Heavy boots pounded against the marble floor outside in the main lobby. 3 armed bank security guards, flanked by 2 plainclothes federal agents, appeared on the other side of the glass wall. Sterling, the bank manager, tapped a code into his terminal, releasing the magnetic lock on the conference room door. The heavy glass door swung open. The lead federal agent stepped into the room holding up a gold badge. "Bradley Vance." He announced, his voice booming with absolute authority. "You are under arrest for international wire fraud and felony forgery." Brad snapped. Pure animal panic overtook him. As the agents moved forward to place him in handcuffs, Brad spun violently around, looking for any possible exit. Dominique was standing directly in his path, still reaching out to him with tears streaming down her ruined makeup. "Get out of my way!" he roared. He planted both hands firmly on her shoulders and shoved her violently backward with all his strength. Dominique slammed hard into the glass wall and crumpled to the carpeted floor with a sharp cry of pain. The federal agents immediately tackled Brad, slamming him face first onto the polished mahogany table. The silver iPad showing his crimes slid across the wood and clattered to the floor. Brad thrashed wildly against the agents, struggling against the heavy steel handcuffs biting deeply into his wrists. "You cannot arrest me," he screamed, spit flying from his mouth as he glared violently at my mother and father. "I am not going down for this alone. If I go to a federal prison, I am taking all of you with me. I have the secondary ledgers, Yvonne. I have the insurance files, and I am handing every single one of your dirty secrets over to the feds right now." The heavy weight of the federal agents pressed Brad into the polished mahogany, but he did not stop thrashing. Instead, a wet, guttural laugh tore from his throat. It was the sound of a man who had completely lost his grip on reality. He twisted his neck, scraping his cheek against the wood just so he could look directly at Marcus and Yvonne. "You think you are safe because the money did not move." Brad spat, his voice echoing in the glass room. "You think you get to go back to your pathetic little country club and pretend nothing happened? You are already bankrupt. Every single one of you is completely ruined." Dominique pushed herself up from the floor, her designer dress torn and her makeup running in dark streaks down her face. She stared at the man she had worshipped, the man who was supposed to guarantee her elite status forever. "What are you talking about?" she choked out. "Brad, what did you do?" Brad locked eyes with his wife, and the absolute disdain in his gaze made her flinch. "There is no money, Dominique. The accounts have been empty since February. I lost everything in a massive cryptocurrency collapse. Millions of dollars liquidated in a matter of hours. The cars, the dinners, your endless shopping sprees, it was all funded by ghost money." The color drained from Dominique's face. She swayed on her feet, the perfectly curated illusion of her upper-class life instantly vaporizing. Yvonne stepped forward, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "If you lost everything, how have you been paying for your lifestyle? How did you maintain the firm?" "I went to the shadow markets, Yvonne." Brad sneered, a manic gleam in his eye. "I needed liquidity fast, so I secured an $8 million loan from a private equity syndicate. It was supposed to be temporary bridge capital until I could secure Desmond's trust fund." Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "No legitimate equity firm gives an $8 million uncollateralized loan to a failing broker. How did you secure the debt?" Brad's manic grin widened, exposing blood on his teeth where he had bitten his own lip during the struggle. "I did not use my capital, Marcus. I used yours. I used my pristine reputation to gain access to your private portfolios. I forged your signatures and used every single asset you possess as cross-collateral. Your retirement accounts, your investment portfolios, and the deed to that $12 million Buckhead mansion. It all belongs to the syndicate now." Yvonne let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his suit, shaking him violently. "Tell me that is a lie. Tell me he cannot do that legally. The banks will never allow it. We will sue. We will go to the authorities." Brad laughed so hard his shoulders shook beneath the grip of the federal agents. "You do not understand who I borrowed from, Yvonne. These are not bankers in tailored suits. This is a ruthless, anonymous syndicate. They operate completely outside the boundaries of the law. They do not file lawsuits. They do not respect court injunctions. They break legs, not contracts." The absolute reality of their situation crashed down on my parents. They were not just facing financial ruin. They were facing immediate violent retribution. "My payment is due at the end of the week." Brad continued, his voice rising in a desperate, triumphant crescendo. "The only way I could pay it off was with Desmond's offshore cash. If these federal agents drag me out of here and freeze my accounts, I will default on the loan." The second that happens, the syndicate will not come looking for me in a federal holding cell. They will come directly to your front door. They will seize the Buckhead estate. They will strip you of every asset you own. And if you try to stop them, they will take the balance out in blood." Dominique collapsed back onto the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. The wealthy, refined white husband her parents had practically worshipped, the man they believed elevated their social standing, had just handed them a death sentence. He had used them as nothing more than disposable human shields to protect his own catastrophic failures. Marcus was hyperventilating, his hand clutching his chest as he stared at the floor. Yvonne was completely paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing silently as the terror consumed her. They were looking at total annihilation, homelessness, poverty, and the looming threat of extreme physical violence. I stood perfectly still at the head of the mahogany table. I did not gasp. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of comfort to the people who had spent my entire life treating me like a disease. I watched Brad's total meltdown with an eerily calm, predatory gaze. He thought this grand confession would force my hand. He thought the threat of violence against my parents would compel me to call off the federal agents to let him process the forged wire transfer, just to save the family from the syndicate. He believed my family loyalty could be weaponized against me. He was wrong. "Get him out of my sight!" I commanded the lead federal agent, my voice ringing out with absolute chilling authority. Brad's eyes widened in sudden, profound terror as the agents hauled him roughly to his feet. "Wait!" he screamed, thrashing against the handcuffs as they dragged him toward the glass doors. "Imani, you cannot do this. They will kill your parents. They will take everything." Imani. I stood in the center of the room and watched as they dragged my brother-in-law out into the main lobby, his desperate screams echoing off the marble walls until the elevator doors finally slid shut. The silence that returned to the conference room was suffocating. Dominique was weeping hysterically on the floor. Marcus and Yvonne stood trembling, completely stripped of their arrogance, their wealth, and their pride. They were utterly defenseless, waiting for the syndicate to arrive and destroy whatever was left of their pathetic lives. I looked down at the three of them, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, sweet vindication. The long, silent ride back to the Buckhead estate was a death march. I did not accompany them. I returned to my glass corner office to watch the final act play out on my surveillance feeds, while they retreated to their $12 million tomb. By the time Marcus pulled his least luxury sedan into the circular driveway, the rented industrial generator had finally burned through its last drop of diesel. The massive stone mansion sat in total, absolute darkness. It was completely stripped of its grandeur, looking more like a looming fortress closing in around them than a symbol of ultimate wealth. They huddled in the cavernous grand foyer, jumping at every sound. The silence of the powerless house was deafening, broken only by the frantic pacing of Marcus's leather shoes on the imported Italian marble. The reality of Brad's confession was settling into their bones like frost. They were completely exposed. Marcus crept toward the towering front windows, pulling back the edge of the heavy silk drapes by a fraction of an inch. His breath hitched. He stepped back from the glass, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. Two completely unmarked matte black SUVs were parked at the very edge of the cul-de-sac. Their engines were idling quietly. Their headlights were off, but the faint glow of a cigarette cherry flared from the rolled-down driver's side window of the lead vehicle. The shadow syndicate Brad had borrowed from did not waste time. They already knew Brad was in federal custody, and they had immediately sent their collectors to secure their cross-collateral assets. They were simply sitting out there in the dark, watching the house and waiting. Every passing shadow, every gust of wind against the windows sent a fresh wave of panic through the frozen house. The sheer suffocating terror of being hunted finally snapped the last remaining thread of family loyalty. The toxic hierarchy that had defined my entire existence completely collapsed. Yvonne spun away from the window and unleashed decades of venom directly at her favorite daughter. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at Dominique, her face twisting into a mask of vicious, absolute disgust. She screamed that Dominique was a foolish, naive little girl who had ruined their entire lives. She demanded to know how Dominique could be so incredibly stupid to live with a man, sleep in the same bed with him, and have absolutely no idea he was a massive financial fraud. She called her an ignorant liability who had thrown away the family empire on a worthless criminal. Marcus immediately joined the assault. The man who had spent my entire life praising Dominique's poise and elegance now cornered her in the dark foyer, screaming that she was a complete failure. He yelled that she had brought a parasite into their home. He called her an embarrassment to the family name, shouting that she was supposed to be the smart one, the perfect daughter who elevated their status, but instead she had signed their actual death warrants. He paced around her, waving his arms and cursing her judgment, demanding to know how she could let this happen to him. For the first time in 30 years, Dominique was experiencing the exact same brutal, unyielding psychological abuse they had inflicted on me every single day. The golden child pedestal was ripped out from under her, and she crashed violently to the floor. But Dominique did not cower quietly. The betrayal broke her completely open and she snapped. She screamed right back at them, her voice echoing sharply off the vaulted ceiling. She yelled that they had absolutely no right to judge her. She stepped toward Yvonne, her face smeared with ruined makeup, and shouted that she had never even loved Brad. She confessed that she only married him because Yvonne had relentlessly pressured her to secure a wealthy white savior. Dominique sobbed hysterically as she laid out the brutal truth. She reminded her mother of the endless lectures about finding a man with a trust fund and the right pedigree. She screamed that Yvonne had practically forced her down the aisle, telling her that marrying a white Ivy League broker was the only way their black family would ever be truly accepted by the elite country club circles they were so desperately obsessed with joining. Dominique pointed at her father and yelled that he had practically handed his life savings to Brad because he was addicted to the proximity to white wealth. She shrieked that she had sacrificed her entire life, her actual happiness, just to play the role of the perfect high society trophy wife they demanded, and now they were blaming her for giving them exactly what they asked for. The brutal, ugly truth hung in the freezing air of the dark foyer. Yvonne stood completely frozen, her mouth opening and closing without making a sound. Marcus looked away, unable to meet his daughter's tear-filled eyes. Their entire superficial empire of status and social climbing had been built on a foundation of self-hatred, and it had just collapsed and crushed them all. Before anyone could say another word, a sharp, heavy scrape echoed from the front door. All three of them jumped spinning toward the massive oak entryway. The shadow of a man shifted on the other side of the frosted sidelight glass. There was no knock. There was no doorbell. There was only the distinct sound of thick paper sliding over the marble floor. Footsteps retreated down the front steps, moving with calm, terrifying precision toward the idling SUVs. Marcus hesitated for a long, agonizing moment before he finally found the courage to step forward. His hands were shaking violently as he bent down and picked up the thick black envelope that had been pushed underneath the heavy oak door. There was no return address. There was no postage. He ripped open the flap. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock typed in a stark, bold font. Marcus read the words and his knees buckled. He sank onto the cold marble floor, the paper slipping from his hands. Yvonne snatched it up, her eyes darting across the page. It was a formal 24-hour notice of default. The syndicate was calling in the entire $8 million debt. The letter stated with chilling brevity that the Buckhead Mansion, all associated investment portfolios, and both of my parents' private pension funds would be seized by 6:00 tomorrow evening. A handwritten note at the bottom added a final terrifying postscript, stating that any attempt to flee the property or contact law enforcement would result in immediate physical collection of the debt. They were trapped in a dark, freezing house with a shadow syndicate waiting outside. They had exactly 24 hours before they lost everything they had ever owned, and the people coming to collect did not negotiate. The morning sun brought absolutely no warmth to the freezing stone mansion. By 8 a.m., the local news was already broadcasting the final nail in their coffin. A breaking news ticker at the bottom of Marcus's phone screen confirmed that Brad had been formally charged with international wire fraud and denied bail. He had abandoned Dominique to face the Shadow Syndicate entirely alone. Marcus spent the next 2 hours frantically dialing every contact in his phone. He called the country club elite the golf buddies and the fellow investors who had eaten caviar at his dinner table just days prior. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The few who did answer immediately hung up the second they heard his voice. Word of the federal investigation and the syndicate debt had already swept through Atlanta's upper echelon. My parents were officially radioactive. Marcus finally lowered his phone, his hands trembling violently. He looked at Yvonne and Dominique, both huddled in the grand living room, wrapped in heavy coats. He stated the undeniable truth. There was only one person left in the entire state of Georgia with enough liquid capital to wire $8 million by nightfall. Yvonne instantly recoiled, her pride flaring up like a dying ember. She flatly refused. She declared she would rather die than beg that ungrateful girl for a single dime. She paced the dark room, clinging to the delusional belief that she was still the powerful matriarch of a wealthy dynasty. Her delusion lasted exactly 15 minutes. Heavy footsteps echoed on the gravel outside. Marcus rushed to the window just in time to see 3 men in dark jackets calmly walk up the circular driveway. They did not try to break in. They simply slapped bright neon yellow seizure notices across the windshield of Marcus's Porsche and Yvonne's prized Mercedes. The syndicate was marking their territory, securing the assets for evening collection. The absolute terror of imminent violent homelessness finally broke Yvonne. She collapsed against the wall, sobbing in sheer unadulterated panic. Her pride evaporated, because the syndicate was actively watching their luxury cars. Marcus was forced to use the last functioning credit card he had to arrange a quiet rental. A beat-up, nondescript gray sedan was dropped off at the back service entrance of the estate. The golden child, the proud father, and the arrogant mother piled into the cheap cloth seats, looking over their shoulders like hunted prey as they drove away from their $12 million tomb. The drive to downtown Atlanta was executed in suffocating silence. When they finally pulled up to the towering glass skyscraper that housed my corporate headquarters, the sheer scale of my empire loomed over them. They walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the sprawling, immaculate marble lobby. They were disheveled, exhausted, and utterly stripped of their usual country club arrogance. Marcus approached the massive reception desk, clearing his throat and attempting to summon his old commanding tone. He demanded to see me immediately, announcing himself as my father. The receptionist did not blink. She did not express awe or deference. She checked her digital schedule and politely informed him that I was in back-to-back meetings. She instructed them to sit in the waiting area, treating them with the exact same detached professional courtesy she would give to a common solicitor trying to sell printer toner. For 4 agonizing hours, Yvonne, Marcus, and Dominique sat on the lobby sofas. They were forced to watch a relentless parade of high-powered executives, international clients, and elite legal teams walk past them, all seeking my time and my capital. The people who had spent 3 decades treating me like an embarrassing burden were now completely at my mercy, trapped in the lobby of my kingdom, praying I would grant them an audience. At precisely 2 p.m., my head of security escorted them into the private elevator. They were brought to the top floor and guided into my panoramic boardroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the entire Atlanta skyline. I was seated at the head of a massive obsidian table, dressed in an immaculate tailored designer suit projecting absolute untouchable power. The second the glass doors closed behind them, Yvonne dropped her pride entirely. She launched into a desperate theatrical performance. She rushed toward the edge of the table, bursting into loud, hysterical tears. She begged me to buy the Buckhead mansion. She pleaded with me to pay off the syndicate, utilizing every toxic manipulation tactic she had ever possessed. She cried out that we were blood, that she was my mother, and that family must protect family in times of crisis. Marcus stepped up right beside her, offering empty, pathetic apologies. He swore he had always known I was the brilliant one, the true success of the family, practically groveling as he asked for my financial salvation. Dominique simply stood by the door, weeping silently, a broken shell of the golden child she used to be. I did not interrupt them. I did not speak a single word. I sat perfectly still, my expression a mask of cold, predatory calm. I let them cry. I let them beg. I let them completely humiliate themselves for a full, uninterrupted 10 minutes. High-definition security cameras embedded in the boardroom ceiling recorded every single pathetic, groveling apology, capturing the absolute destruction of their egos for my permanent archives. When they finally ran out of breath, their manipulative tears drying up as they waited desperately for my response, the silence in the boardroom became deafening. I looked at the three people who had made my childhood a living nightmare. Then, moving with slow, deliberate precision, I reached across the obsidian table and slowly opened the sleek black leather folder resting in front of me. I pulled a thick stack of stapled, notarized documents from the velvet interior of the folder. The heavy parchment landed on the polished obsidian glass with a dull, authoritative thud. With one manicured finger, I pushed the stack across the long expanse of the table. It slid to a smooth stop directly in front of Marcus. His tear-stained face contorted in confusion. He wiped his eyes with the back of his trembling hand, looking from the documents to my face and back down again, entirely unsure of what he was looking at. "Read the top left corner, Marcus." I instructed, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a gavel dropping. His shaking hands fumbled with the first page. He blinked rapidly, struggling to focus his vision through the sheer panic that had consumed him all morning. I watched his eyes track the bold, embossed letters at the top of the contract. Then I watched his gaze slowly drift up, moving from the paper in his hands to the massive frosted glass wall behind my desk. The logo etched into the glass matched the letterhead on the debt contract perfectly. A stylized sharp crest belonging to my private equity firm. The color drained from his face so fast he looked as though he might physically expire right there in the ergonomic chair. His lips moved, trembling violently, but no sound came out. The paper slipped from his grasp, fluttering back down to the table. "What is this?" Yvonne demanded, her voice shrill and desperate as she leaned over his shoulder to look at the paperwork. "Imani, what is this? What does this mean?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, clasping my hands together. Brad did not borrow $8 million from an anonymous shadow syndicate mother. I stated the words cold, precise, and utterly lethal. He borrowed it from Apex Holdings, a subsidiary shell corporation completely owned and operated by my private equity firm. The silence that followed was absolute. Dominique stopped weeping, her breath catching in her throat. Yvonne's mouth hung open. Marcus sat paralyzed, staring at the logo on the glass wall as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his forehead. "I am the shadow lender," I said, letting the reality of the statement settle over them like a concrete vault. "I saw Brad flailing months ago. He was bleeding cash, desperate for a bridge loan, and incredibly stupid. He came to the shadow markets looking for a lifeline to maintain the illusion of wealth you all worshipped him for. My firm happily provided the rope he needed to hang himself. He signed away everything. He cross-collateralized your entire lives because he was too arrogant to read the fine print of the corporate structure he was dealing with." I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket, and began to pace the length of the boardroom. My footsteps were the only sound in the room, clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. "I own the debt, Marcus," I continued, my voice echoing off the panoramic windows. "I own the $12 million Buckhead estate you love to flaunt. I own the titles to the Porsche and the Mercedes that my repo agents tagged in your driveway this morning. I own your private pension funds, your offshore retirement accounts, and the deed to Dominique's pathetic little socialite boutique that never turned a single dime of profit. I own the art on your walls and the jewelry in your safes." I stopped pacing and looked directly down at my mother, locking eyes with the woman who had made me feel worthless for 3 decades. "I own every single asset you possess." Yvonne let out a sound that was half gasp, half choke. It was the sound of a woman whose entire universe had just been obliterated in a matter of seconds. "You," she stammered, backing away from the table, her hands raised as if to physically ward off my words. "You did this. You set us up. You ruined your own family." I did not force Brad to commit international wire fraud. I corrected sharply, cutting off her hysterical deflection. I did not force him to forge your signatures on those asset transfers. I did not force you to blindly worship a con artist just because he had the right complexion, a country club membership, and a superficial pedigree. I simply bought the debt he created. I purchased your ruin wholesale. Dominique slid out of her chair and sank onto the carpeted floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She began rocking back and forth, completely catatonic, her mind unable to process the magnitude of the betrayal. The husband she thought validated her existence had robbed her blind, and the sister she had mocked her entire life now held her life in the palm of her hand. Marcus was hyperventilating, his hands gripping the edge of the obsidian table so hard his knuckles turned white. "Imani, please." He wheezed, his chest heaving as tears of absolute terror spilled down his cheeks. "We are your blood. You cannot do this. You cannot throw us out on the street. We will have nothing. We will be nobody. You are exactly who you have always been." I replied, staring down at him with zero pity. "You are just finally wearing the price tag that matches your actual worth." They had exhausted every ounce of their pride to come here. They had swallowed decades of supreme arrogance to sit in my lobby like peasants. They had wept, begged, and groveled, utilizing every manipulative tear they could summon, believing they were offering me the ultimate opportunity to play the hero. They genuinely thought I would be so desperate for their love and validation that I would blindly write a check to save them from the wolves. The sheer, suffocating horror on their faces was palpable, radiating through the room like heat off fresh asphalt. Their eyes were wide, taking in the cold, immaculate boardroom, and the daughter they had thrown away, who now sat on a throne built from their confiscated wealth. They finally realized they had not come to beg a savior. They had crawled on their hands and knees, weeping and pleading directly to their executioner. Dominique was the first to completely break. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the massive boardroom, leaving her gasping for air in short, frantic bursts. Her perfectly manicured hands clawed at the plush carpet as a violent panic attack seized her chest. She stared up at me, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute disbelief. The reality of the situation was a physical weight crushing her lungs. The sister she had spent a lifetime mocking as socially inept and worthless, the sister she had relentlessly bullied for refusing to conform to their country club aesthetics, had just completely and utterly destroyed her highly educated, supposedly superior husband. "You knew," Dominique choked out, her voice a ragged, hysterical squeak. "You knew Brad was committing fraud. You trapped him. You outsmarted him." "I did not have to trap your husband, Dominique," I replied, my voice slicing through her panic like a scalpel. He walked into my snare completely blinded by the exact same arrogance that plagues this entire family. He thought he was the smartest man in the room because of his Wharton degree and his white privilege. He thought he could borrow ghost capital to cover his catastrophic trading losses, and no one would ever notice. He never bothered to investigate the parent company of the syndicate he was begging for cash. I just sat back and let his own bottomless greed do the heavy lifting. Dominique sobbed, wrapping her arms tightly around her stomach. "But my life," she wailed. "My house, my business. Brad gave me everything. He gave you absolutely nothing." I stepped away from the table, walking slowly toward where she crouched on the floor. I looked down at her, delivering the brutal, unvarnished truth with meticulous precision. "Let us break down your perfect, superior existence, Dominique. Let us look at the math behind the illusion. Your breathtaking destination wedding in Santorini. That was funded by a high-yield, short-term shadow loan, the $12 million Buckhead mansion. The deed was cross-collateralized against father's failing investment portfolio to secure liquidity. That precious high-end boutique you pretend to run in Midtown. It has operated at a massive loss for 3 straight years, kept afloat only by siphoning stolen funds from Uncle Desmond's accounts." Yvonne let out a sharp, horrified gasp as the financial reality of her favorite daughter's life was laid bare, but I did not stop. "Every single achievement this family ever praised you for was a hollow, fraudulent lie." I stated, my words ringing with cold, terrifying authority. "You were nothing but a beautiful parasite attached to a larger, more destructive parasite. You spent your entire life practicing how to hold a champagne flute and smile for the society pages. Meanwhile, I was learning how to dismantle corporate hedge funds. While you were marrying a criminal because mother convinced you a white savior would elevate our social standing, I was building an empire on ruthless, undeniable intelligence. I did not marry into power. I became it. The absolute finality of my words stripped away the last remaining shreds of Dominique's delusions. Her entire identity had been completely annihilated. She dragged herself up from the carpet, leaning heavily against the edge of the obsidian boardroom table. Her hands were shaking so violently that her diamond tennis bracelets rattled against the glass. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden pathetic desperation. "Imani, please," she begged, her voice cracking as she switched tactics. She reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I stepped back, my expression turning instantly glacial. "Please, you have to stop this. I am your sister. We shared a room. We grew up together. We are blood. Just forgive my portion of the debt. Let me keep my boutique. Let me just walk away and start over. Have some sisterly love, Imani. I am begging you." I stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing. The sheer audacity of her invoking sisterly love after 30 years of psychological torment was almost impressive. Sisterly love. I repeated, testing the words on my tongue like a foreign substance. "You want to invoke sisterly love now, when you are staring down the barrel of total bankruptcy." I leaned forward, planting both hands flat on the table, bringing my face inches from hers. My voice dropped to a lethal, chilling whisper. "Sisterly love died a very long time ago, Dominique. It died on a Tuesday evening in November. I was 10 years old. It was pouring freezing rain and I had forgotten my house key. I stood on the back patio for 2 hours, shivering, soaked to the bone, terrified of the dark. I banged on the sliding glass door until my knuckles bled. And you stood right there on the other side of the glass, perfectly warm, perfectly dry, in the kitchen. You looked right at me, Dominique. You locked the deadbolt and you laughed. You left me out in the freezing rain just because you thought it was funny to watch the ugly, unwanted sister suffer." Dominique flinched as if I had struck her across the face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The memory was undeniable. "You did not show me mercy when I was a freezing child." I whispered, my gaze locking her in place. "And I will not show you mercy when you are a fraudulent adult. I am foreclosing on your entire life. You have until 6 o'clock tomorrow to pack whatever fits in a garbage bag." Marcus could not handle the shift in the power dynamic. The fragile, toxic ego he had cultivated for decades completely shattered. He could not accept that the daughter he had treated like a worthless burden was now dictating the terms of his survival. He pushed himself up from his chair, his face turning a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. He puffed out his chest, desperately trying to summon the patriarchal authority he no longer possessed. "You listen to me right now, little girl," Marcus bellowed, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. "I am your father. I brought you into this world and you will respect me. You are going to void these contracts immediately. You are going to sign over that debt, and you are going to fix this family. I am giving you a direct order." I did not blink, I did not flinch. I simply stood up straight, maintaining direct, unyielding eye contact with the man who had failed me in every conceivable way. I reached across the smooth surface of my desk and pressed a silver button on my intercom console. "Send in the legal enforcement and acquisition team," I commanded, quietly sealing their fate. "Let us begin the liquidations." The heavy double-glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a sharp, synchronized click. My legal enforcement team, flanked by 4 towering corporate security guards in immaculate black suits, marched into the room. Their synchronized footsteps sounded like a military drumbeat, signaling the absolute end of the line. The sight of them carrying thick leather binders packed with foreclosure notices, frozen asset confirmations, and immediate eviction mandates broke whatever fragile mental barrier my mother had left. Yvonne collapsed. Her legs gave out completely, and she crashed onto the imported rug with a heavy, undignified thud. The perfectly tailored designer coat she wore pooled around her like a deflated parachute, instantly robbed of its elegance. All her country club vanity, All her lifelong obsession with appearances, the carefully constructed facade of the untouchable matriarch, completely vanished into thin air. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, moving with a desperate animalistic frenzy. She reached out and violently grabbed the hem of my tailored skirt. Real tears thick with ruined makeup and absolute primal terror streamed down her cheeks, staining the pristine fabric. She begged. She wailed my name, her voice cracking as she pleaded for her house, her cars, her social standing. She promised she would change. She swore she would be the mother I always wanted if I just called off the enforcement team. She offered to work for me, to publicly apologize to my face, to do anything to avoid the humiliation of being thrown onto the street empty-handed. She gripped my skirt tighter, her knuckles white, shaking uncontrollably, as the reality of impending poverty crushed her. I looked down at the woman clutching my clothes. I searched myself for a shred of empathy, a flicker of daughterly guilt. But I felt a profound, chilling emptiness. There was no joy in this victory, no sadness in her destruction, just absolute terrifying apathy. I smoothly took a deliberate step back, forcing her fingers to slip from the fabric. I looked at her tear-stained face, remembering the countless times she had looked at me with visceral, unmasked disgust. I tilted my head, studying her pathetic state. 18 years ago, I was a teenager holding a rejection letter from a prestigious internship, hoping for a single shred of comfort. Instead, you packed my bags in the middle of a storm and threw them onto the driveway because my temporary failure made you look bad in front of your shallow friends. I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the dead silent room. I leaned down slightly, making sure every syllable landed with devastating surgical precision. I repeated the exact words she had spat at me that day, the words that had fueled my ruthless ascent to the top. "Get out of here. There is no place for people who embarrass me." Yvonne gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been shot at point-blank range. She tried to lunge forward again, crying out for another chance, her hands grasping at the empty air. I simply straightened my posture and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the security team. The guards moved instantly. Two massive men gripped Yvonne by the arms, lifting her off the floor effortlessly. Her designer heels kicked wildly in the air as they carried her backward. Another pair of guards seized Marcus by the shoulders. He tried to resist, puffing out his chest one last time, screaming that he was my father and demanding respect, but he was entirely powerless against the sheer physical force of the men. They marched him toward the exit, ignoring his frantic, breathless threats of legal action that he could no longer afford. Dominique did not wait to be grabbed. The sight of our parents being manhandled broke her completely. She scrambled to her feet and ran out the door, her hands covering her face, a weeping, destroyed shell of the golden child she used to be. My parents wailed as they were hauled out of the boardroom. The sound of their hysterical sobbing and Marcus's desperate shouting echoed loudly down the long glass-paneled hallway. Executives, junior partners, and administrative staff members stepped out of their offices, watching in stunned silence as the former king and queen of Atlanta society were physically dragged toward the elevators like common trespassers. The public humiliation they had feared their entire lives was happening in high definition, broadcast to the exact caliber of people they had spent decades trying to impress. I remained perfectly still, standing at the head of the obsidian table, watching the chaotic scene unfold through the open boardroom doors. As the security team forced them into the awaiting elevator, Yvonne let out one final agonizing scream of my name before the heavy steel doors slid shut, with a definitive clang, cutting her off completely and plunging the hallway back into professional silence. I turned my attention back to the table, calmly adjusting the cuffs of my suit jacket. My lead acquisition attorney stepped forward, holding a sleek digital tablet loaded with the final liquidation orders. He cleared his throat, entirely unfazed by the familial destruction he had just witnessed, and asked if we should proceed with the standard severance allocation to prevent their immediate total bankruptcy. I looked at the digital pen in his hand, then out the panoramic window at the sprawling city I now controlled. I instructed him to execute the final asset seizures immediately. I made it absolutely ruthlessly clear that he was to take the houses, the cars, the offshore accounts, and the business portfolios without leaving them a single cent of settlement. The execution of my orders was a masterclass in ruthless corporate efficiency. Within 24 hours, the illusion of the Grand Family dynasty was systematically dismantled, piece by piece. It began at dawn the very next morning at the Buckhead estate. 6 federal marshals, accompanied by a team of my private asset liquidators, bypassed the heavy iron security gates and marched directly up the pristine cobblestone driveway. They did not knock. They used a court-mandated override to open the massive oak doors, their heavy boots echoing loudly against the imported Italian marble floors. Yvonne and Marcus were abruptly ripped from their sleep. My mother stumbled out of the master suite wearing a silk robe, her face pale with shock, as agents began cataloging the artwork right off the walls. She frantically attempted to grab a handful of her diamond necklaces and designer handbags, shrieking that they were her personal property. A federal marshal calmly intercepted her. He presented a laminated document proving that every single luxury item in the house had been purchased against the fraudulent credit line. Everything she touched legally belonged to me. The marshals gave them exactly 15 minutes to vacate the premises. They were forced out into the crisp morning air wearing nothing but the simple street clothes on their backs. Marcus stood shivering on the curb, completely powerless as the heavy iron gates swung shut and locked him out of his own life forever. While my parents were being thrown onto the street, the full weight of the United States justice system came crashing down on their golden son-in-law. Brad never made it onto his flight to the Cayman Islands. He was transferred from the airport holding cell directly to a maximum security federal detention center. The evidence my firm handed over to the authorities was irrefutable, an airtight labyrinth of forged signatures, illegal wire transfers, and blatant identity theft. There was no leniency, no high-priced legal defense team rushing to his aid. To protect their own pristine reputation, Brad's aristocratic old money parents completely disowned him. They issued a public statement condemning his actions and cut him off from the family trust entirely. Cornered and abandoned, Brad faced an aggressive federal prosecutor who refused to offer a plea deal. He was formally indicted on 24 counts of corporate fraud and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The arrogant, Ivy League mastermind was reduced to an inmate number destined to spend the best decades of his life behind cold steel bars. With her husband incarcerated and her family completely bankrupt, Dominique's entire reality violently collapsed. The bank immediately seized the Midtown boutique she had spent years pretending to manage. Her credit score evaporated overnight. She had spent her entire adult life relying on Brad's stolen wealth and our parents' toxic validation, leaving her with no actual job skills, no work ethic, and absolutely zero safety net. Forced to file for Chapter 7, bankruptcy. Dominique hit absolute rock bottom. The glamorous socialite who used to turn her nose up at anyone wearing last season's fashion was forced to take a minimum wage job at a greasy 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. Her custom designer dresses were replaced by a stiff polyester uniform that permanently smelled of stale coffee and fryer grease. She spent her days wiping down sticky tables and pouring cheap coffee, forced to force a polite smile and bite her tongue while serving the exact same working-class people she had spent her entire life mocking. For Yvonne and Marcus, the financial ruin was only the beginning of their punishment. The true agony was their total social annihilation. The Atlanta Black elite is a closed, unforgiving circle that operates entirely on capital and reputation. The moment news of the federal raid and the syndicate debt hit the social pages, my parents were instantly excommunicated. Their exclusive country club memberships were revoked under a moral turpitude clause. Their calls to old friends, former colleagues, and political allies were universally blocked. They became radioactive outcasts, toxic pariahs that nobody wanted to be seen with. Stripped of their wealth, their home, and their social standing, they had absolutely nowhere left to turn. With zero assets and ruined credit profiles, no luxury high-rise would accept their rental applications. They were ultimately forced to sign a lease for a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a decaying rundown complex on the south side of the city. It was the exact same impoverished, neglected neighborhood they had spent 40 years desperately running away from. The poetic justice was absolute. Marcus, the man who used to boast about his tailored suits and imported cigars, was now forced to ride the public bus sitting in exhausted silence among the very people he considered beneath him. Yvonne was trapped in a tiny roach-infested living room with peeling linoleum floors and a rattling window air conditioning unit. She spent her days sitting on a cheap sagging mattress staring blankly at the stained drywall. There were no more galas, no more country club brunches, no more wealthy friends to impress. Her legacy, her pride, and her entire ego had been ground into fine dust. They were finally forced to live the exact life they had always believed they were too good for. As the sun set over the city, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured lawns of the ultra-wealthy, I stood perfectly still on the sidewalk outside the Buckhead estate. The massive house was completely dark, silent, and empty. I looked up at the towering brick columns, the sprawling balconies, and the heavy iron gates that had once represented everything I was excluded from. 6 months later, those same heavy iron gates stood wide open, permanently locked in place, to welcome anyone who needed safe harbor. The oppressive, manufactured silence that used to choke the Buckhead estate had been entirely eradicated. The suffocating aura of Yvonne and Marcus's country club vanity was gone, ripped out down to the very studs and replaced with breathing, living purpose. I had hired a highly aggressive team of commercial contractors to completely gut the interior of the $12 million mansion. We operated with a ruthless, purifying efficiency. We stripped away the faux European statues, the heavy, dust-collecting velvet drapes, and the gaudy gold leaf trim that my mother had plastered over every conceivable surface to mask our family's spiritual and financial bankruptcy. The massive wine cellar where Marcus used to hide his illegal shadow ledgers and smoke imported cigars was demolished and rebuilt into a professional-grade podcasting and recording studio. Yvonne's colossal multi-room walk-in closet, once stuffed to the ceiling with haute couture paid for by stolen syndicate funds, was converted into a brightly lit crisis counseling and mental health center. In their place, we built light. We knocked down the restrictive load-bearing walls of the formal dining room, the very room where I had been forced to sit in freezing silence while Dominique was praised for her hollow achievements. We transformed that space into a sprawling, state-of-the-art computer lab and coding incubator. The sterile, untouchable front parlor was now a collaborative study lounge featuring floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, vibrant seating, and constant, undeniable energy. The estate was no longer a cold monument to exclusion and elitism. It was a fortress. It was the Desmond Foundation. I named it after my uncle, the only person in my bloodline who had ever recognized my potential or treated me with a shred of human decency. We established the property as a premier educational and housing facility dedicated exclusively to displaced African American youth and teenagers aging out of the foster care system. These were kids who had been told, much like I was, that they were unwanted burdens. They were kids who had been locked out in the cold by a society that refused to see their brilliance. Now they had a sanctuary equipped with unlimited resources. We provided full tuition university scholarships, aggressive corporate mentorship programs, financial literacy boot camps, and a guaranteed safe haven from the world. The sprawling, perfectly manicured lawn that my parents used to obsessively maintain was currently occupied by dozens of teenagers. They were not walking on eggshells. They were lounging on the grass, debating literature, writing code, pitching business plans, and actually laughing. The air vibrated with the electric, undeniable pulse of a future being built from scratch. I stood on the master balcony, leaning against the smooth stone railing, watching a group of girls collaborate on a robotics project under the shade of a massive oak tree. The Georgia sun was warm against my skin, casting a bright golden hue over the campus. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest for 3 decades was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, diamond-hard clarity. The glass door behind me slid open with a soft, mechanical hum. Attorney Sterling stepped out onto the balcony. He was dressed in his usual immaculate charcoal suit, but his typical cutthroat boardroom intensity had softened into a look of profound, quiet respect. He walked over and stood beside me, resting his hands on the stone railing, looking out over the vibrant scene unfolding on the lawn below. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the kids thrive in the very space that was originally designed to keep them out. Sterling reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick-bound folder. He handed it to me. The heavy parchment paper felt cool and definitive against my skin. "These are the finalized deeds," he stated, his voice calm and steady. "The property transfers are fully executed. The endowments are permanently locked into the trust, and the board of directors has been officially seated. The Desmond Foundation is entirely autonomous and fully operational. There is no legal mechanism, no loophole, and no syndicate maneuver on Earth that can ever undo this." I took the folder, tracing my finger over the embossed corporate seal on the cover. I did not open it. I did not need to verify the paperwork. The proof of our total victory was laughing and studying right in front of us. "Thank you, Sterling," I replied, keeping my eyes on the students below. "For everything." He nodded, turning his gaze toward the horizon. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a rare break in his usual absolute certainty. He looked back at me, his expression searching, analyzing the emotional toll of the past year. "You dismantled their entire reality in a matter of hours," he said quietly, ensuring his words did not carry over the balcony. "You stripped them of their home, their stolen wealth, their freedom, and their social standing. You forced them into the exact life they spent 40 years running from and mocking. I have to ask, Imani, after everything is said and done, when you look at what this house used to be and what it is right now, do you feel any guilt for leaving your parents with absolutely nothing?" I turned my head slowly, meeting his gaze directly. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I let his question hang in the air for a single defining heartbeat. I looked back out over the sprawling green lawn at the teenagers who were finally being given a fair fighting chance at life. I lifted my porcelain cup and took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The warmth spread through my chest, perfectly mirroring the cold, absolute truth of my reality. "I didn't leave them with nothing," I replied, my voice ringing with total, unshakable finality. "I left them with exactly what they gave me. But unlike them, I took nothing and built an empire." I turned my gaze away from the foundation and looked upward. Beyond the tree line, the towering glass and steel skyscrapers of the Atlanta skyline gleamed brightly in the afternoon sun, reflecting the immense, undeniable power of the world I had conquered.